The Last Great Adventure. Margaret Whitmore had always believed that success was measured in pharmaceutical patents and quarterly board meetings. At 72, she was the kind of woman who wore Chanel suits to charity galas, drove a pristine silver Bentley that still smelled of leather conditioner, and lived in a Beacon Hill mansion where every antique knew its proper place. The irony wasn't lost on her that a woman who had spent her entire career developing life-saving medications had never actually savored living. Margaret was a creature of habit, routine, and carefully calculated philanthropic contributions. Her days began at 6 sharp with Earl Grey tea and the Wall Street Journal, followed by a 20-minute chauffeur ride to Whitmore Pharmaceuticals, where she held the title of Chairman Emeritus. But on this particular Wednesday morning in March, Margaret Whitmore's perfectly ordered world began to crumble. The persistent fatigue that had been bothering her for months finally drove her to see Dr. Patricia Chen, a no-nonsense oncologist with kind eyes and a habit of delivering devastating news with the same tone she might use to discuss stock portfolios. "I'm afraid it's pancreatic cancer, Margaret," she said, sliding the scan images across her mahogany desk. "Stage 4. The tumors have metastasized beyond the pancreas." Margaret stared at the ghostly white masses on the dark films, trying to process words that seemed to belong in someone else's medical file. She had never smoked, drank only wine with dinner, and maintained a strict exercise regimen with her personal trainer. Cancer was something that happened to other people. People who made poor lifestyle choices or lacked access to premium health care. "What's the prognosis?" she asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded despite the tremor in her hands. Dr. Chen removed her glasses and cleaned them slowly, a gesture Margaret would later recognize as her way of buying time before delivering impossible news. 4 to 6 months, possibly less with aggressive treatment. "I'm sorry, Margaret. I wish I had different information to share." The ride home in her Bentley was a blur of Boston traffic and half-formed thoughts. Margaret found herself sitting in her circular driveway for 30 minutes, staring at her federal-style mansion with its perfect landscaping and wondering why none of it seemed significant anymore. Inside, her husband Charles was reviewing legal documents in his study, humming softly to himself as he organized papers with the same methodical precision that Margaret applied to everything in her life. "How did your appointment go?" he asked without looking up from his contracts. Margaret opened her mouth to tell him, then closed it again. How do you tell the person you've shared 45 years with that your time together is being measured in months instead of decades? How do you explain that all the estate planning, the European river cruise they'd been considering, the great-grandchildren they hoped to spoil someday, had just evaporated like morning fog? "Routine screening," she said instead. "Nothing unusual to report." That night, Margaret lay awake staring at the coffered ceiling while Charles slept peacefully beside her. She tried to imagine what 6 months would look like, tried to picture her final days, but her mind kept circling back to a single, terrifying realization. What had she actually accomplished with her 72 years on Earth beyond accumulating wealth and social status? The answer was more depressing than the diagnosis itself. She had built a pharmaceutical empire, donated millions to various causes, and maintained an impeccable reputation in Boston society. But when she tried to think of moments that had truly mattered, moments that had made her feel genuinely alive, she came up empty. Her life had been a masterpiece of efficiency and a disaster of authentic experience. 3 days later, Margaret found herself back at Boston General Hospital for her first round of staging tests. The oncology wing was a strange place, filled with people who looked perfectly normal, until you noticed the subtle signs, the careful way they moved, the brittle brightness in their eyes, the family members who spoke too loudly about mundane topics to fill uncomfortable silences. Margaret was sitting in the chemotherapy consultation area, watching an elderly man work on what appeared to be the world's most complex crossword puzzle, when she heard laughter coming from the adjacent chair. Not polite, restrained chuckling, but deep, genuine belly laughter that seemed completely out of place in a room full of people fighting for their lives. The source of the laughter was a woman roughly Margaret's age, but where Margaret was all sharp angles and careful grooming. This woman was round and comfortable, like a favorite grandmother's embrace. Her hair was completely silver, styled in natural curls, and her face was deeply lined from what appeared to be decades of uninhibited joy. She was regaling a young technician with a story about her granddaughter's attempt to teach her to use Instagram. "So there I am," the woman was saying, her voice carrying the rich, melodious tones of someone who had clearly spent time on stage, trying to take what she calls a selfie with this contraption. "And instead, I somehow managed to video call my ex-husband's new wife in Miami. Poor woman thought someone was having a medical emergency because all she could see was my nostril and hear heavy breathing." The technician was laughing despite himself, and even some of the other patients had started to smile. Margaret found herself drawn to the warmth of the woman's presence, the way she seemed to create a bubble of normalcy in a place where nothing felt normal anymore. "Ruby Washington," the woman said, extending a well-manicured but clearly work-worn hand toward Margaret. and you look like a woman who could use a friend right about now." Margaret hesitated for a moment. She wasn't the type of person who struck up conversations with strangers, especially not in hospital waiting rooms. But something about Ruby's open, unpretentious manner made her respond despite her usual reserve. "Margaret Whitmore," she replied. Accepting the handshake, Ruby's grip was firm and warm, the handshake of a woman who had worked for everything she'd achieved in life. "So what brings you to this particular corner of paradise, Margaret?" Ruby asked with a grin that suggested she already knew the answer but was asking anyway out of politeness. "Pancreatic cancer," Margaret said simply. She had been practicing saying it out loud, trying to make the words feel less foreign in her mouth. Ruby nodded with the understanding of someone who had walked the same treacherous path. "Lung cancer here. Honey, stage 4. Spread like gossip in a small town. You, stage 4 as well. 4 to 6 months. They tell me, same timeline for me," Ruby said cheerfully, as if they were comparing vacation itineraries instead of death sentences. "Well, that gives us something in common right off the bat, doesn't it?" Over the next hour, as they waited for their respective consultations, Margaret learned that Ruby Washington was unlike anyone she had ever encountered in her carefully curated social circles. Where Margaret had spent her career in boardrooms and pharmaceutical laboratories, Ruby had been a jazz singer in her younger years, performing in clubs throughout the South during the Civil Rights era, before transitioning into community activism and eventually opening a successful soul food restaurant in Atlanta. Ruby had been married once, widowed young, and had raised 3 children as a single mother while building her business from nothing. She had 5 grandchildren scattered across the country, 7 great-grandchildren, and what seemed like an inexhaustible supply of stories about adventures that ranged from the mildly improbable to the completely outrageous. "I once spent 3 days in a Nashville jail," Ruby was saying, "because I refused to stop singing freedom songs during a sit-in at Woolworth's lunch counter." Turns out that having a voice that carries 3 blocks isn't always an advantage when you're trying to practice civil disobedience quietly. Margaret found herself genuinely laughing for the first time in weeks. There was something infectious about Ruby's approach to life, her ability to find humor and meaning in situations that would have sent Margaret running for the nearest legal counsel. "What about you, Margaret?" Ruby asked. "What's the most spontaneous thing you've ever done in your perfectly organized life?" Margaret thought for a long moment, running through decades of carefully planned decisions and risk-averse choices. "I once bought stock in a startup without consulting my financial advisor first," she said finally. Ruby stared at her for a moment, then burst out laughing again. "Sweet Jesus, Margaret, we need to work on that. A woman's got to have better stories than unauthorized stock purchases when she meets her maker." When they were called for their respective appointments, Ruby stood up and patted Margaret on the shoulder with surprising familiarity. "Listen here. We're going to be seeing a lot of each other over the next few months. What do you say we make it interesting instead of depressing?" Margaret wasn't sure what Ruby meant by interesting, but she found herself looking forward to finding out. For the first time since her diagnosis, she had something to anticipate besides test results and treatment schedules. Over the following weeks, Margaret and Ruby's friendship deepened through the strange intimacy of shared medical appointments and chemotherapy sessions. They developed a routine of arriving early and staying late, using the hospital cafeteria as their unofficial headquarters for conversations that ranged from the profound to the ridiculous. Ruby had a gift for extracting stories from Margaret, stories that Margaret hadn't even realized she possessed. Under Ruby's patient questioning, Margaret found herself talking about her childhood in Connecticut, her early dreams of becoming a medical researcher before inheriting the family pharmaceutical business, the moment she met Charles at a Harvard alumni function and knew immediately that he was the kind of stable, reliable man her parents would approve of. "So what happened to the medical researcher dream?" Ruby asked one afternoon as they sat watching the snow fall outside the hospital windows. Margaret shrugged, a gesture that had become habitual when discussing roads not taken. Reality happened. Family obligations, business responsibilities, social expectations. Research seemed like an indulgence I couldn't afford. "Couldn't afford or didn't prioritize?" Ruby asked gently. There was no judgment in her voice, just genuine curiosity tinged with the wisdom of someone who had made her own share of difficult choices. The question bothered Margaret more than she cared to admit. Had she really been unable to pursue her dreams? Or had she simply chosen security and family approval over personal fulfillment? Had she built a meaningful life or constructed a very elaborate, socially acceptable prison? "I suppose I always assumed there would be time later," Margaret admitted reluctantly. "After I established myself in the business, after Charles and I traveled more, after we had enough saved for a comfortable retirement. There was always going to be time later for personal interests." Ruby nodded with the understanding of someone who had heard similar stories countless times before. "The thing about later, honey, is that it has a nasty habit of never actually arriving. There's always another responsibility, another obligation, another reason to postpone the life you actually want to live." It was during their 5th week of treatment, that Ruby brought up the idea that would change everything. They were sitting in the recovery area, waiting for the anti-nausea medication to take effect, when Ruby pulled out a wrinkled piece of paper from her purse. "I've been thinking about something," she said, unfolding the paper carefully. "My granddaughter Zara, the one who's been trying to teach me about social media. She asked me something last week that got me thinking. She wanted to know what I would do if I could do anything in the world. Money and time, no object." Margaret looked at the paper Ruby was holding. In careful handwriting, someone had written Ruby's bucket list at the top, followed by a dozen items in different colored inks. "So I started making a list," Ruby continued. "Things I've always wanted to do but never got around to. Things that seem too crazy or too expensive or too impractical for a woman of my age and background. Then I thought, what the hell am I saving my money for? My kids are grown and successful. My grandkids have college funds, and I've got enough put away to live comfortably for whatever time I have left." She paused to take a sip of ginger tea, savoring it with the deliberate attention of someone who knows that simple pleasures are precious. "Besides, I realized I don't want to do these things alone. Adventures are better when you have someone to share them with. Someone who can remind you later that yes, you really did jump out of a perfectly good airplane, or yes, you really did swim with dolphins in the Caribbean." Margaret read through the list, her eyes widening with each item. Skydiving in New Hampshire, driving a NASCAR race car at professional speeds, taking a helicopter tour of the Grand Canyon, seeing the northern lights in Alaska, swimming with sharks in the Bahamas. The list was ambitious, terrifying, and completely unlike anything Margaret would have ever considered appropriate for women of their age and social standing. "This is quite an ambitious undertaking," Margaret said carefully, her natural conservatism warring with something that might have been excitement. "It's just the beginning," Ruby replied with a grin that reminded Margaret of a mischievous child planning an elaborate prank. "The thing is, I realized I don't want to spend my remaining time sitting in waiting rooms feeling sorry for myself. I want to pack a lifetime of adventure into whatever months I have left." Ruby fixed Margaret with a direct stare that was both challenging and hopeful. "What do you say, Margaret? Want to help an old fool check some items off her bucket list? I promise it'll be more interesting than board meetings and charity galas." Margaret felt something stirring in her chest, something she hadn't experienced in decades. It might have been terror or excitement, or possibly both. The rational part of her mind immediately began cataloging all the reasons why Ruby's proposal was impractical, dangerous, and completely irresponsible for women of their age and medical condition. But another part of her mind, a part that had been dormant for decades, was whispering something different. When was the last time she had felt truly alive? When was the last time she had done something simply because it sounded amazing, rather than because it made financial or social sense? "I don't know, Ruby," Margaret said slowly. "I'm not exactly the adventurous type. I've spent my entire life avoiding unnecessary risks. Neither was I, until I decided to be," Ruby replied with the confidence of someone who had reinvented herself multiple times throughout her life. "The way I see it, we've got 4 to 6 months to pack a lifetime of living into. We can spend that time in hospital beds and treatment centers, managing our decline with dignity, or we can spend it living like we've never lived before." Ruby leaned forward, her voice taking on an intensity that Margaret had never heard before. "I've been thinking about what I want people to say at my funeral. Margaret, I don't want them talking about what a responsible businesswoman I was, or how I never missed a charity board meeting, or how I always followed doctor's orders perfectly. I want them to tell stories about the crazy things I did, the chances I took, the way I squeezed every drop of joy out of the time I had." Margaret looked at the list again, trying to imagine herself doing any of the things Ruby had written down. The old Margaret would have dismissed the entire idea as a midlife crisis run completely amok. But the old Margaret had also spent 72 years living safely, and had nothing to show for it but a successful business empire and a comfortable bank account. "What about our families?" Margaret asked. "What about Charles? He's been my anchor for 45 years. What if something happens to me during one of these adventures?" "Charles is a good man," Margaret said, more to herself than to Ruby. "He deserves better than watching me waste away in a hospital bed, diminishing day by day until there's nothing left of the woman he married. Maybe if I actually did something worth remembering, it would give him something positive to hold on to after I'm gone." Ruby studied Margaret's face, reading the internal struggle that was playing out behind her carefully controlled expression. "You know what the real tragedy is? Margaret, it's not that we're dying. Everyone dies eventually. Honey, the real tragedy is that most people never really live. They spend their whole lives preparing for life instead of actually living it." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow, partly because they were so harsh and partly because they were so undeniably true. How many adventures had she postponed? How many dreams had she deferred in favor of social expectations? How many moments of spontaneous joy had she sacrificed on the altar of responsible behavior and family obligations? "If I said yes," Margaret said slowly, And I'm not saying I am. How would this work practically? I mean, we're both 70-plus women with serious medical conditions. Insurance companies alone would have heart attacks. Ruby's face lit up like a child's on Christmas morning. Leave the details to me. Honey, I've got connections, resources, and a lifetime of figuring out how to make impossible things happen on a shoestring budget. All you have to do is say yes and be ready for the ride of your life. Margaret looked around the hospital recovery room, taking in the IV drips, the monitors, the general atmosphere of managed medical decline. Then she looked at Ruby's face, animated with possibility and hope despite everything they were both facing. For perhaps the first time in her adult life, Margaret Whitmore made a decision based entirely on what she wanted, rather than what made sense according to social expectations or financial prudence. Okay, she said quietly, her voice growing stronger with each word. Let's do it. Let's make these months count for something. Ruby let out a whoop that caused several nurses to look in their direction with concern and amusement. That's what I'm talking about. Margaret Whitmore, your real life is about to begin. Honey, as they shook hands on their unlikely partnership, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in decades. The thrill of stepping into the unknown. She had no idea what adventures lay ahead. No concept of how dramatically her remaining months would differ from the carefully controlled existence she had constructed over 7 decades. But for the first time since her diagnosis, Margaret Whitmore was genuinely looking forward to tomorrow. And the day after that, and whatever extraordinary experiences Ruby Washington was about to introduce into her previously predictable world, the transformation of Margaret Whitmore began on a Thursday morning in April, when Ruby Washington arrived at her pristine Beacon Hill mansion, driving what could only be described as a mechanical work of art. The vintage Harley-Davidson motorcycle gleamed in the morning sun, its chrome surfaces reflecting the carefully manicured Georgian townhouses like mirrors. Charles Whitmore stood at the French doors of their breakfast room, coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips, watching his wife of 45 years climb onto the back of a motorcycle driven by a woman he had met exactly once. Margaret, who had never owned anything more adventurous than a luxury sedan, was wearing a leather jacket that Ruby had somehow procured overnight and a helmet that made her look like an aging astronaut preparing for launch. Are you absolutely certain about this decision? Charles called from the front steps, his voice carrying a mixture of concern and something that might have been suppressed envy. Margaret turned to look at her husband, taking in his worried expression and the way he was gripping the wrought iron railing. For a moment, the old Margaret almost reasserted itself, almost climbed off the motorcycle and returned to the safety of routine and social propriety. Then Ruby revved the engine, the sound rumbling through the quiet Back Bay neighborhood like controlled thunder. And Margaret felt something wild and long forgotten stir in her chest. I've never been more certain of anything in my entire life, she called back, surprised by the absolute truth of her words and the strength in her voice. Their first destination was a small airfield outside Manchester, New Hampshire, where Ruby had arranged for Margaret to experience her first taste of controlled terror. The skydiving instructor was a woman named Captain Jessica Martinez, a former Air Force pilot who had logged more than 4,000 jumps and had the kind of calm confidence that made jumping from perfectly functional aircraft seem like the most reasonable activity in the world. First time, she asked Margaret as she helped her into the complex harness system. First time for a lot of things. Apparently, Margaret replied, watching Ruby chat animatedly with another instructor about wind patterns and landing techniques with the easy familiarity of someone discussing weekend gardening plans. Captain Martinez studied Margaret with the assessing gaze of someone who had seen every possible type of fear and excitement that humans could produce. What changed your mind about jumping out of airplanes at 72? Margaret considered the question as Martinez tightened the straps around her legs and shoulders with professional efficiency. I realized I've been living my entire life as a passenger in someone else's vehicle, she said finally. It's time I tried taking the controls for whatever time I have left. 25 minutes later, Margaret Whitmore found herself sitting in the open doorway of a small aircraft, 14,000 feet above the New Hampshire landscape, with nothing between her and the ground but a few pieces of carefully folded nylon and an enormous amount of faith in Captain Martinez's expertise. The wind was howling past the aircraft with a sound like the apocalypse, and Margaret's stomach was attempting to relocate itself somewhere near her throat. You ready for this adventure? Margaret, Ruby shouted over the engine noise. She was strapped to her own instructor and looked like she was about to attend an elegant garden party rather than fling herself into the void at terminal velocity. Margaret wanted to say no, wanted to ask the pilot to turn around and land immediately, wanted to return to her safe, predictable life where the biggest risk was choosing between municipal bonds and treasury bills. Instead, she found herself nodding and giving Ruby a thumbs up that she hoped looked more confident than she felt inside. On three, Captain Martinez said in her ear with professional calm, 1, 2. She didn't wait for 3. Margaret found herself tumbling through space, the aircraft disappearing above her with shocking speed while the ground rushed up to meet her with equally shocking enthusiasm. For approximately 15 seconds, her mind went completely blank, overwhelmed by the impossibility of what was happening to her 72-year-old body. Then something remarkable occurred. The terror transformed into something else entirely, something that felt like pure joy mixed with liquid electricity. Margaret heard herself laughing, actually laughing out loud, as she fell through the sky at terminal velocity. The landscape below spread out like a living tapestry, roads and rivers and forests arranged in patterns that she had never imagined from her usual ground-level perspective. When Captain Martinez deployed the parachute, the violent deceleration felt like being gently caught by divine intervention. They drifted down through the afternoon air in relative silence, Margaret taking in views that she knew she would remember for the rest of her life, however long that might be. How was that experience? Ruby asked when they touched down in the designated landing area, both women slightly unsteady on their legs but grinning like teenagers. Margaret was still catching her breath, still processing what had just happened to her entire worldview. I think I understand now, she said finally, pulling off her helmet and letting the wind blow through her silver hair. Understand what? Honey, why people become addicted to this feeling. I feel like I've been sleepwalking for 72 years and someone just threw ice water on my face. Ruby grinned and clapped her on the shoulder with genuine pride. Welcome to the land of the living, Margaret. And this was just the warm-up act. Over the next 2 weeks, Ruby proved that her definition of warm-up was considerably more intense than anything Margaret had previously considered remotely appropriate for women of their age. They went whitewater rafting down the Kennebec River in Maine, where Margaret learned that nature had absolutely no respect for carefully laid plans, and that sometimes the best strategy was simply to hold on tight and trust the current to carry you safely downstream. They visited a professional racing school outside Charlotte, where Margaret finally got to experience the thrill of driving a real NASCAR vehicle at speeds that would have horrified her insurance agent behind the wheel of a modified stock car. With the engine roaring and the track blurring past at 170 miles per hour, Margaret experienced a kind of meditation through velocity that she had never imagined possible. How do you feel right now? The driving instructor asked after Margaret climbed out of the car, her legs shaky and her face flushed with pure adrenaline. Like I've been living in black and white my whole life. And someone just handed me a complete set of oil paints, Margaret replied, still breathless from the experience. But it wasn't just the extreme activities that were changing Margaret fundamentally. It was Ruby's approach to everything, her ability to find adventure and genuine human connection in the most ordinary circumstances. When they stopped for lunch at a roadside diner in Vermont, Ruby struck up a conversation with their waitress about her dreams of opening her own catering business. Within 30 minutes, she had the young woman laughing about her worst customer stories and sharing her secret recipe for maple-glazed salmon. How do you do that so effortlessly? Margaret asked as they continued their journey south in Ruby's rented convertible. Do what, honey? Connect with people like that. Make them feel like they've known you for years when you just met them 5 minutes ago. Ruby considered the question as she navigated the winding mountain highway, her silver curls dancing in the wind. I guess I realized a long time ago that everyone has a story worth hearing, and most people are just waiting for someone to ask them about it with genuine interest. We spend so much time trying to impress each other with our accomplishments that we forget to be curious about who we actually are underneath all the resume items. That evening, they reached Las Vegas, where Ruby had arranged for them to stay at a hotel that was approximately the opposite of everything Margaret had ever considered tasteful or appropriate. The suite was decorated in a style that could best be described as Baroque casino, with gold fixtures, red velvet furniture, and a view of the strip that looked like someone had spilled a jewelry box across the Nevada desert. This is, Margaret began, then stopped, realizing she didn't have adequate words for what this experience was. Over the top. Ridiculous, completely unnecessary and ostentatious, Ruby suggested helpfully, clearly enjoying Margaret's culture shock. Perfect, Margaret said, surprising herself with the sincerity of her response. It's completely and utterly perfect for what we're trying to accomplish here. They spent the evening exploring the casino floor, where Ruby taught Margaret how to play poker with the kind of casual expertise that suggested a colorfully misspent youth. Margaret, who had never gambled more than $20 on charity raffles, found herself betting with the reckless abandon of someone who had finally grasped that money was just a tool for creating meaningful experiences. The secret to poker, Ruby explained as they sat at a low-stakes table surrounded by tourists and professional gamblers, isn't really about the cards you're holding. It's about reading people, understanding what they want and what they're afraid of losing. Most of life is like that, actually. Margaret studied the other players at their table, trying to apply Ruby's wisdom practically. There was a young couple from Ohio celebrating their wedding anniversary, an elderly man who seemed to be playing more for the social interaction than the potential winnings, and a woman in her 40s who approached each hand with the focused intensity of a chess grandmaster planning 12 moves ahead. "What do you think she wants?" Margaret asked quietly, nodding toward the intensely focused woman. Ruby watched her for several hands, taking in her posture, her betting patterns, the way she held her cards like precious secrets. "Control," she said finally with certainty. "She's here because it's one of the few places where she feels like she has complete control over the outcome. My guess is that most of her life feels pretty chaotic right now, so she comes here to feel powerful." As if to prove Ruby's psychological assessment correct, the woman suddenly pushed all her chips into the center of the table, a move that was either brilliant strategy or complete desperation. She lost the hand spectacularly, collected her purse with quiet dignity, and walked away without looking back or showing any emotion. "How did you know that about her?" Margaret asked, genuinely impressed by Ruby's insight. "Practice," Ruby replied simply, "and paying attention to people instead of just waiting for my turn to talk. Most people go through life so focused on where they're going that they never notice where they are or who they're traveling with." The next morning brought their most ambitious adventure yet, a helicopter tour of the Grand Canyon that Ruby had somehow arranged to include a landing on a remote plateau where they would spend the afternoon exploring one of the most spectacular landscapes on Earth. Margaret had seen pictures of the Grand Canyon, of course, had even flown over it once during a business trip to Phoenix 20 years earlier, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of standing on the edge of that vast chasm, feeling the wind that had carved those ancient rocks over millions of years, and looking down into geological history that stretched back to the very beginning of time. Makes you feel pretty insignificant, doesn't it? Ruby said, settling down on a rock outcropping with the easy grace of someone who had spent considerable time in wild places throughout her life. "Small, but also connected somehow," Margaret replied, struggling to articulate the profound feeling that was washing over her. "Like I'm part of something much larger than my business empire or my investment portfolio or my carefully planned social calendar." They spent the afternoon exploring the plateau, with Ruby pointing out rock formations and desert plants with the enthusiasm of a natural-born educator. Margaret learned that her new friend had spent years exploring the American Southwest, not as a tourist checking items off a list, but as someone who genuinely loved the landscape and wanted to understand its secrets. "I used to come out here when my husband was dying of cancer," Ruby admitted as they sat watching the sun begin its descent toward the western rim of the canyon. "Something about this place puts everything in perspective. Your problems seem pretty manageable when you're looking at rocks that are older than complex life on Earth. Is that why you never remarried after he passed?" Margaret asked gently. Ruby was quiet for a long moment, watching a hawk circle in the thermals rising from the canyon floor far below. "I thought about it a few times," she said finally. "Had some good men interested over the years, but I realized I had married James because I loved him, not because society told me that's what successful women were supposed to do. After he died, I couldn't find anyone else who made me want to share my life completely." She turned to look at Margaret directly. "The thing is, I spent so many years taking care of other people, my kids, my husband, my restaurant customers, my community, that I forgot to figure out who I was when I wasn't taking care of somebody else. By the time I remembered, I realized I actually liked my own company pretty well. And now," Margaret asked, "now I'm dying, but I'm finally living exactly the way I want to," Ruby said with a smile that contained equal parts sadness and pure joy. "Funny how that works out sometimes, isn't it?" That evening, they returned to Las Vegas for what Ruby described as a proper celebration of questionable decision-making. They ate dinner at a restaurant that served portions large enough to feed entire villages, watched a show featuring tigers and elaborate costumes that defied both physics and good taste, and ended the night at a piano bar, where Ruby somehow talked Margaret into singing "My Way" in front of a room full of complete strangers. Margaret, who had never sung karaoke in her life and barely sang in church, found herself belting out Frank Sinatra with the passionate conviction of someone who was finally understanding what the song actually meant on a personal level. When she reached the final chorus, "I did it my way," she felt something shift inside her chest, something that felt like a door opening after being locked for 7 decades. "Not bad for a beginner," Ruby said as they walked back to their hotel through the neon-lit streets, both women slightly tipsy on wine and pure exhilaration. "I can't believe I just did that," Margaret said, shaking her head in amazement. 6 weeks ago, I wouldn't have sung happy birthday at a family party if someone paid me $1,000. 6 weeks ago, you were a different person entirely," Ruby replied with certainty. "The question is, who do you want to be tomorrow? And the day after that, It was a question that Margaret found herself pondering as they began planning the international portion of their adventure. Ruby had connections everywhere. It seemed friends and acquaintances scattered across multiple continents who were eager to help facilitate their bucket list journey. Their first international destination was Paris, where Ruby's friend Claude Dubois ran a small motorcycle touring company that specialized in showing visitors the France that most tourists never experienced. Claude was roughly Ruby's age, with the kind of weathered face that suggested a lifetime of outdoor adventures and the easy confidence of someone who had never met a stranger he couldn't eventually charm. "So you are the famous Margaret I have been hearing so much about," Claude said in accented English as he greeted them at Charles de Gaulle Airport. "Ruby tells me you are learning to live dangerously for the first time." "I'm learning to live. Period," Margaret replied, realizing as she said it that this was becoming her standard response to questions about her dramatic transformation. Claude had arranged for them to stay in a small boutique hotel in Montmartre, the kind of place that appeared in romantic movies, but that Margaret would never have found on her own through traditional travel agencies. Their room overlooked a cobblestone street barely wide enough for one small car, with a view of the Sacré-Cœur Basilica that looked like something from a vintage postcard. "This is how people should travel," Ruby said as they sat on their tiny wrought iron balcony, drinking wine that Claude had recommended and watching the evening light paint the ancient buildings in shades of gold and amber. Not rushing from one tourist attraction to another, checking items off a list, but actually experiencing a place and its people. The next morning, Claude provided them with motorcycles and led them on a tour of the French countryside that was unlike anything Margaret had ever experienced in her previous travels. They rode through villages that seemed untouched by the modern world, stopped at family-owned vineyards where the wine was served with bread and cheese that had been made according to recipes passed down through generations. At one particularly memorable stop, they found themselves at a small cafe in Provence where the owner, a woman named Marie, who appeared to be roughly 80 years old, insisted on telling them the complete history of every dish she served. Her English was limited, and Margaret's French was practically non-existent, but somehow they managed to communicate through a combination of gestures, enthusiasm, and Ruby's surprising ability to charm people in any language. "She says you have kind eyes," Ruby translated as Marie patted Margaret's cheek with motherly affection, "and that you should come back when you have more time to properly appreciate her cooking and learn some French phrases." "Tell her I will," Margaret said, meaning it completely and already planning her return visit in her mind. As their European adventure continued, Margaret began to notice changes in herself that went far beyond just the willingness to try new experiences. She was sleeping better, laughing more frequently, and feeling more present in each moment than she had in years. Even her physical symptoms seemed less prominent, as if her body was responding positively to her improved mental state and renewed sense of purpose. In Rome, they climbed to the top of St. Peter's Basilica and looked out over a city that had been continuously inhabited for more than 2,000 years. In Barcelona, they spent an entire afternoon in Park Güell, marveling at Gaudi's architectural fantasies and discussing the courage it must have taken to create something so completely original in the face of conventional expectations. But it was in the Swiss Alps that Margaret experienced what she would later describe as her moment of complete spiritual awakening. They had taken a train to Jungfraujoch, the top of Europe, where the views stretched across a landscape of snow-covered peaks that seemed to go on forever in every direction. Standing on that observation platform, breathing air so clean it seemed to cleanse her lungs with each inhalation, Margaret felt something she had never experienced before: complete and total presence in the moment. No thoughts about business responsibilities. No worries about the future. No regrets about the past. Just herself, standing in one of the most beautiful places on earth, fully alive and completely aware of being genuinely alive for perhaps the first time in her adult life. "You look different," Ruby observed as they rode the train back down the mountain, watching Margaret's face in the reflection of the window. "I feel different," Margaret replied with wonder. "I feel like I'm finally inhabiting my own life instead of just observing it from the outside like a polite spectator." Ruby nodded with the understanding of someone who had taken her own journey from observer to full participant in life. "That's the real secret. You know, not the adventures themselves, but learning to be completely present for whatever's happening right now." Most people spend their whole lives waiting for their real life to begin. As they planned their next destination, Margaret realized that Ruby had given her something far more valuable than a series of exciting experiences. She had given her a completely new way of being in the world, a new understanding of what it meant to be fully alive and engaged with existence. The old Margaret Whitmore had died somewhere between that first motorcycle ride and this moment on top of the world. In her place was someone Margaret was just beginning to get to know, someone who was eager to see what extraordinary adventures lay ahead. The first sign of serious tension between Margaret and Ruby came on a rainy morning in London, where they had stopped to visit the Tower of London and cross another item off their increasingly ambitious list. Margaret was feeling particularly energetic that day, invigorated by their recent European adventures and confident in her newfound ability to embrace the unexpected with genuine enthusiasm. Ruby, however, seemed unusually subdued as they walked through the ancient fortress, listening to a beef-eater guide regale tourists with tales of royal executions and political intrigue. Margaret noticed that her friend was moving more slowly than usual, pausing frequently to catch her breath, and wearing the kind of forced smile that people use when they're trying to hide significant physical discomfort. "You feeling all right today, Ruby?" Margaret asked during a quiet moment as they stood looking at the crown jewels, the ancient gems sparkling under museum lighting. "Just a little tired from all our traveling," Ruby replied, but Margaret could see the lie clearly written in her eyes. They had been adventuring together for nearly 3 months now, and Margaret had learned to read her friend's moods and physical states with increasing accuracy. That evening, in their hotel room overlooking the Thames, Ruby finally admitted what Margaret had already begun to suspect with growing dread. The cancer was progressing faster than the doctors had initially predicted. The experimental treatment she had been receiving back in Atlanta was no longer working effectively, and her oncologist wanted her to return immediately for more aggressive intervention. "How long have you known about this?" Margaret asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear rising in her throat. "About 3 weeks," Ruby said, settling heavily into an armchair by the window, looking older and more fragile than Margaret had ever seen her. "I got the call when we were in Rome, but I didn't want to ruin what we were building together. We were having such an incredible time. And you were finally starting to really live authentically. I couldn't bear to bring everything crashing down around us." Margaret felt a surge of anger that surprised her with its intensity and immediacy. "That wasn't your decision to make alone. Ruby, I had a right to know what was happening with your health. We're partners in this journey." "Did you really?" Ruby asked quietly, her voice carrying decades of hard-won wisdom. "What would you have done differently if you'd known 3 weeks ago? Would you have enjoyed Rome less? Would you have been less present during those incredible moments on top of the Swiss Alps? Or would you have spent the last 3 weeks worrying about something you couldn't control instead of living the life we promised each other we'd live?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that neither woman wanted to fully acknowledge or examine. Margaret realized that Ruby was probably right. That knowledge of her deteriorating condition would have colored every subsequent experience with a shadow of impending loss and anxiety. But she also realized that their friendship had evolved into something much deeper than mutual adventure companionship. Ruby had become the closest friend Margaret had ever had in her 72 years, and the thought of losing her felt like losing a part of herself she had only recently discovered and come to treasure. "So what do we do now?" Margaret asked finally, her practical nature asserting itself even in the face of emotional turmoil. Ruby pulled out their bucket list, now much longer than the original version and covered with check marks representing experiences that had exceeded their wildest dreams and expectations. Near the bottom of the list, in Ruby's careful handwriting, were 2 items that they had been deliberately saving for last: see the pyramids and touch the top of the world. "We finished what we started," Ruby said simply, her voice regaining some of its characteristic strength and determination. "Egypt first, then Nepal. After that, we'll see what kind of time we have left and make the most of it." 3 days later, they found themselves in Cairo, where the modern city pressed against ancient wonders with the kind of casual juxtaposition that could only exist in a place where history was measured in millennia rather than centuries. Their guide was a man named Ahmed Hassan, a professor of archaeology at Cairo University, who had agreed to show them the Giza complex from a perspective that most tourists never experienced or even knew existed. "Many people come here expecting to be impressed primarily by the size of the pyramids," Ahmed explained as they stood in the shadow of the Great Pyramid of Cheops, the massive limestone blocks towering above them. "But size is not what makes these structures truly remarkable. It is the precision, the mathematical perfection. The fact that human beings 4,000 years ago created something that we would struggle to build today, even with all our modern technology." Margaret found herself overwhelmed by the weight of standing in the presence of something so ancient and enduring. These stones had been carefully arranged by human hands when her own civilization was nothing more than scattered tribes, had witnessed the rise and fall of entire empires, had survived wars and natural disasters and the simple erosion of countless centuries. "Makes you think about legacy, doesn't it?" Ruby said as they climbed carefully up one of the interior passages, following Ahmed's flashlight beam through corridors that had been dark for centuries at a time. "What do you mean specifically?" Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew where this conversation was heading. "What we leave behind when we're gone from this world. These pyramid builders have been dead for 40 centuries, but we're still here talking about them, still marveling at what they accomplished with primitive tools and pure determination. What will people say about us in 4,000 years? Will they say anything at all? It was a question that had been haunting Margaret since their difficult conversation in London. What kind of legacy was she actually leaving behind? Her pharmaceutical work would be obsolete within a decade. Her financial success would mean nothing to anyone but her immediate family. And until recently, she had accumulated no stories worth telling to future generations. But now, thanks to Ruby's transformative influence, she was becoming someone who had genuine stories to share. Someone who had jumped out of airplanes and driven race cars and sung karaoke in Las Vegas with complete strangers. Someone who had learned to connect authentically with people and appreciate beauty and live fully in each precious moment. That evening, they sat on the terrace of their hotel, looking out over the Nile River, while the call to prayer echoed across the city from dozens of minarets scattered throughout the ancient metropolis. The sound was haunting and beautiful, a reminder that they were visitors in a culture much older and more complex than their own. "I need to tell you something important," Margaret said, having spent the entire day building up courage for a conversation she wasn't sure she was emotionally ready to have. Ruby looked at her with the patient attention she always gave to serious moments, setting down her tea and giving Margaret her complete focus. "I called Charles yesterday while you were napping," Margaret continued carefully. "I told him everything. About the cancer diagnosis, about our entire adventure, about how much I've changed as a person. And I told him that I love him more now than I ever have, but that I needed to finish this journey with you before I could come home." "How did he take that news?" Ruby asked with genuine concern. "Better than I expected. Honestly," Margaret admitted with relief. "He said he'd been wondering why I seemed so different during our phone calls, why I sounded happier and more alive than I had in years. He said he was proud of me for finally learning to live authentically, instead of just existing according to other people's expectations." Ruby nodded with approval. "Charles is a good man. He deserves to know who his wife really is, not just who she's been pretending to be for 45 years of marriage. There's something else," Margaret said, her voice growing more serious. "He wants to meet you properly. He's flying to Nepal to join us for the Everest Base Camp trek. He said if this is how I want to spend my remaining time, he wants to be part of it and support me." Ruby was quiet for a long moment, processing this unexpected development and its implications for their dynamic. "How do you feel about that possibility?" "Terrified," Margaret said with complete honesty. "This whole journey has been about becoming someone new, someone different from the woman he married all those years ago. What if he doesn't like who I've become? What if I can't maintain this new version of myself when I'm back in the context of my old life and relationships? Or what if," Ruby suggested gently, "he falls in love with who you really are instead of who you thought you had to be for all those decades?" The flight to Kathmandu was Ruby's idea of a final test of their commitment to living completely without reservations or safety nets. Instead of taking a direct commercial flight, she had arranged for them to travel on a cargo plane that made stops in 3 different countries and required them to sleep on canvas seats surrounded by crates of mysterious origin. "This is either character building or borderline insane," Margaret shouted over the engine noise as they flew through turbulence that felt like riding a mechanical bull at 30,000 feet. "Same thing." "Really?" Ruby shouted back, grinning despite the obvious discomfort the journey was causing her deteriorating body. Kathmandu was a complete sensory assault that made Cairo seem peaceful and organized by comparison. The streets teemed with motorcycles, rickshaws, sacred cows, and pedestrians who seemed to operate according to traffic laws that existed only in some parallel universe. The air was thick with incense, diesel fumes, and the sound of a dozen different languages being spoken simultaneously at maximum volume. Their guide for the Everest Base Camp trek was a man named Pemba Sherpa, whose weathered face and easy smile suggested someone who had spent his entire life in the high mountains and understood their moods intimately. Pemba had climbed Everest 9 times, had guided hundreds of expeditions, and had the kind of calm confidence that came from understanding exactly what the mountains could and could not do to human beings. "You are absolutely sure about this undertaking?" Pemba asked during their briefing meeting, looking from Margaret to Ruby with the assessing gaze of someone who had seen too many overconfident tourists underestimate the Himalayas. "Base camp is 5,300 meters above sea level. Very high, very cold, very difficult even for healthy young men." "We're sure," Ruby said firmly, though Margaret noticed that her friend's voice sounded raspier than usual, and she was gripping her water bottle tightly. "We've come too far to turn back now." Charles arrived the next morning, and Margaret felt her heart stop when she saw him walking through the airport crowd, looking somehow both familiar and foreign at the same time. He looked older than she remembered, with new lines around his eyes and more gray in his hair than she had noticed during their video calls. But he also looked determined and surprisingly adventurous, wearing hiking boots and outdoor gear that suggested he had been preparing for this expedition as seriously as any professional climber. "Hello, stranger," he said when he reached them, and Margaret wasn't sure if he was talking to her or to the version of herself she had become over the past few months. The reunion was awkward at first, complicated by the presence of Ruby and the surreal context of meeting in Nepal to climb mountains together. Charles was polite but reserved with Ruby, clearly trying to reconcile the woman standing before him with the friend who had so dramatically transformed his wife of 4 decades. But during dinner that evening at a traditional Nepalese restaurant, something shifted in the group dynamic. Margaret found herself telling Charles stories about their adventures, and she realized that she was talking differently than she ever had before in their marriage. Instead of focusing on logistics and practical details, she was describing how experiences had made her feel, what they had taught her about herself, how they had fundamentally changed her perspective on what it meant to be alive. "You sound completely different," Charles said as they walked back to their hotel through the narrow, crowded streets of Tamil. "You sound like yourself, but amplified, like someone turned up the volume on your personality and let your true self emerge. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" Margaret asked, genuinely uncertain about his reaction. Charles stopped walking and turned to face her directly under a streetlight. "It's wonderful," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. "I feel like I'm meeting my wife for the first time after 45 years of marriage." The trek to Everest Base Camp began 2 days later, and within hours, Margaret understood completely why Pemba had been concerned about their physical condition and age. The trail climbed relentlessly through landscapes that shifted from subtropical forests to alpine meadows to bare rock and ice. The air grew thinner with each passing day, making every step feel like running upstairs while breathing through a straw. Ruby struggled more than she let on, stopping frequently to rest and using her trekking poles more for support than for balance. But she refused to consider turning back, pushing forward with a determination that bordered on dangerous stubbornness. "This is it," she told Margaret during one of their rest stops, as they sat looking out over a valley that seemed to stretch to the edge of the world. "This is the one that matters most. Everything else we've done has been practice for this moment." Charles proved to be surprisingly natural in the mountains, adapting to the altitude and physical demands with unexpected grace. He and Ruby developed an easy friendship, bonding over shared concerns about Margaret's tendency to push herself too hard and her complete inability to pack efficiently. "How did you put up with her for 45 years? Ruby asked him one evening as they sat around the fire at their tea house, watching Margaret attempt to reorganize her backpack for the 6th time that day. "I kept waiting for her to become the person I thought she could be," Charles replied thoughtfully. "I just never imagined it would take a terminal illness and a motorcycle-riding jazz singer to make it happen." On their 6th day of trekking, they reached Tengboche Monastery, where the monks welcomed them with traditional Tibetan tea and the kind of serene hospitality that could only exist in a place where people had learned to find inner peace at 15,000 feet above sea level. The monastery sat on a ridge with views of Everest, Lhotse, and Amadablam that were so spectacular they seemed almost artificial. That evening, Margaret found herself in conversation with one of the senior monks, a man named Lobsang, who spoke excellent English and seemed genuinely curious about what had brought 3 Americans to his remote corner of the world. "You are seeking something," Lobsang observed. "Not as a question, but as a simple statement of obvious fact. We're seeking the top of the world," Margaret replied, then immediately realized how shallow and materialistic that sounded. Lobsang smiled with the patient kindness of someone who had heard similar answers many times before from Western visitors. "The top of the world is not a physical place," he said gently. "It is a state of consciousness. You can reach it from anywhere, if you understand what you are truly seeking." That night, Margaret lay in her sleeping bag thinking about the monk's profound words. What was she truly seeking on this journey? Adventure, proof that she was still alive, a way to make peace with her impending death. Or was she seeking something simpler and more profound? The experience of being fully present in her own life, fully engaged with the world around her, fully connected to the people who mattered most? The answer came to her the next morning as they continued their ascent toward base camp. Ruby was moving even more slowly than usual, clearly struggling with the altitude and the physical demands of the trek. But when Margaret offered to help carry some of her gear, Ruby waved her off with characteristic stubbornness. "I didn't come this far to be carried to the finish line," Ruby said, breathing heavily but determined to continue under her own power. It was then that Margaret understood what Ruby had been trying to teach her all along. The adventures themselves weren't really the point. The bucket list wasn't actually about checking off experiences or proving anything to anyone else. It was about learning to show up completely for your own life, to engage fully with whatever challenges and opportunities presented themselves, to find meaning and joy and connection even in the face of uncertainty and loss. The final push to base camp took place in conditions that tested every bit of resolve they had developed over the previous months. The weather turned cold and windy, the trail became increasingly treacherous, and the altitude made every breath feel precious and insufficient. But when they finally reached Everest Base Camp, standing among the prayer flags and expedition tents at 17,600 feet above sea level, Margaret felt something that she knew she would carry with her for the rest of her life. However long that might be, she had touched the top of the world, not because she had reached a particular altitude, But because she had finally learned to inhabit her own existence fully and completely, looking out at the towering peak of Everest, with Charles beside her and Ruby grinning despite her obvious exhaustion, Margaret Whitmore knew that she had become the person she was always meant to be. The journey down from base camp would bring new challenges and revelations. But for this moment, standing on top of the world with the people who mattered most, Margaret had everything she needed to call her life complete. The descent from Everest Base Camp marked the beginning of the end, though none of them wanted to acknowledge it at first. Ruby's condition had deteriorated noticeably during the trek, and the high altitude had taken a toll that even her legendary optimism couldn't completely mask. She moved more slowly, required longer rest periods, and had developed a persistent cough that reminded everyone of the relentless enemy they were all fighting. But there was something else different about Ruby now, something that went beyond mere physical symptoms. She had acquired a kind of luminous quality, as if the approaching end of her journey had clarified everything that truly mattered in life. Her conversations became more philosophical, her observations more profound, and her appreciation for simple moments more intense and deliberate. On their last night in Nepal, they sat on the rooftop terrace of their hotel in Kathmandu, sharing a bottle of wine that their guide Pemba had given them as a farewell gift. The city spread out below them in a tapestry of lights and sounds, and the air carried the familiar mixture of incense and exhaust that had become oddly comforting during their stay. "I need to tell you both something," Ruby said, her voice carrying a weight that made Margaret and Charles lean forward instinctively. "The doctors back in Atlanta don't think I have much time left. Maybe a few weeks, possibly less." Margaret reached across the table and took Ruby's hand, squeezing it with this kind of fierce gentleness that only comes from genuine love and impending loss. "How long have you known this?" "Since before we left for Egypt," Ruby admitted quietly. "I've been carrying around these pain medications that could probably stop a charging rhinoceros, and I've been rationing them carefully because I wanted to stay as clear-headed as possible for as long as I could manage." Charles felt the familiar surge of protective anger that had become his default response to Ruby's tendency to hide important medical information. "Damn it, Ruby, we could have changed our plans, taken things easier, spent more time resting instead of pushing so hard." "Doing what exactly?" Ruby interrupted gently but firmly. "Sitting in hospital rooms talking about treatment options, discussing medical procedures and insurance coverage, feeling sorry for ourselves and wasting precious time." "Margaret, Charles, we've packed more genuine living into the last 4 months than most people manage in 4 complete decades." She paused to take a careful sip of wine, savoring it with the deliberate attention of someone who knows that simple pleasures have become infinitely precious. "Besides, I've got one more item on our list, something I've been saving for the very last moment." Ruby pulled out their now famous bucket list, worn and creased from months of constant travel, covered with check marks and notes and small drawings that documented their extraordinary journey together. At the very bottom, in fresh ink that must have been added recently, she had written something new. "Help my dearest friends learn to live fully without me." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow to the chest. Over the past 4 months, Ruby had become far more than a friend or travel companion. She had become Margaret's guide to a completely different way of being in the world, her teacher in the art of living authentically, her partner in adventures that had fundamentally changed who Margaret was as a human being. The thought of continuing this new life without Ruby's constant encouragement and example felt absolutely impossible. Like trying to navigate without a compass or breathe without sufficient oxygen. "I don't know how to do that," Margaret said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything I've learned, everything I've become, it's all been because of your influence and guidance. How do I maintain this person I've become when the person who created her is gone?" Ruby smiled with the infinite patience of someone who had anticipated this exact conversation and had been preparing for it carefully. "You don't maintain her, Margaret. You keep growing her, keep developing her, keep pushing her boundaries. You keep taking risks, connecting with people, finding wonder in ordinary moments. You become the teacher instead of always being the student." Charles had been unusually quiet during this exchange, but now he spoke with the clarity that surprised both women. "She's absolutely right, Margaret. You're not the same person who climbed onto that motorcycle 4 months ago. You've learned to trust yourself completely, to be present in each moment, to find joy in unexpected places. Those aren't skills that disappear when your teacher moves on to whatever comes next." The flight back to Boston was somber despite Ruby's valiant attempts to lighten the mood with her usual repertoire of stories and observations. Margaret found herself studying her friend's face intensely, trying to memorize every detail, every expression, every gesture, knowing that their time together was now being measured in days rather than weeks or months. Ruby had insisted on stopping in Las Vegas for one final night, claiming that their adventure needed to end where it had truly begun, in that ridiculous suite overlooking the Strip. where Margaret had first discovered her capacity for embracing the absurd and finding joy in the unexpected. But this time, instead of gambling and elaborate shows, they spent the evening quietly, sitting on the balcony and talking about everything they had experienced together. Ruby seemed determined to make sure that Margaret understood the deeper lessons behind each adventure. The ways that jumping out of airplanes and climbing mountains had been preparation for the much bigger challenge of living authentically every single day. The real secret, Ruby said as they watched the neon lights paint the desert sky in impossible colors, is to remember that every single day is an adventure waiting to happen. You don't need to jump out of airplanes or climb mountains to live fully and meaningfully. You just need to show up completely for whatever life puts in front of you. Even the ordinary stuff? Margaret asked. Even Monday morning meetings and grocery shopping and paying bills and all the mundane tasks of daily existence, especially the ordinary stuff. Ruby replied with conviction. That's where most of real life actually happens. In the spaces between the big dramatic moments, if you can find wonder and meaning in the everyday experiences, if you can connect authentically with the people around you, if you can stay present and grateful for simple pleasures, then you're living the adventure that matters most. They arrived in Boston on a Tuesday morning in late August, 4 months and a complete lifetime after Margaret had first climbed onto Ruby's motorcycle. The city looked exactly the same, but Margaret felt like she was returning from a journey to an entirely different planet or dimension. Ruby's condition deteriorated rapidly once they stopped the constant traveling and stimulation. It was as if the perpetual motion and excitement of their adventures had been holding the cancer at bay through sheer force of will, and now that they were stationary, the disease was making up for lost time with frightening efficiency. Within a week, Ruby was back in the hospital, connected to machines that monitored her vital signs and dispensed medications that made her drowsy, but did little to ease her increasing discomfort. Margaret spent every possible moment at her bedside, along with Ruby's 3 children and 5 grandchildren, who had flown in from various parts of the country to say their goodbyes. It was during one of these bedside vigils that Ruby's granddaughter Zara, the one who had originally asked her about creating a bucket list, pulled Margaret aside for a private conversation in the hospital corridor. "Grandma Ruby told me about all your adventures together," she said, her voice carrying the kind of directness that only children and very honest adults possess naturally. "She said you learned how to be genuinely happy for the first time in your life. Your grandmother is the wisest person I've ever met," Margaret replied with complete sincerity. "She taught me things about myself and about living that I never would have discovered on my own, even if I'd lived to be 100. Zara studied Margaret with the serious expression of a 20-year-old who had been forced to confront mortality earlier than most people her age. "Are you going to keep being happy and adventurous after she's gone? Are you going to keep living the way she taught you to live?" The question cut straight to the heart of Margaret's deepest fear and uncertainty. Without Ruby's constant encouragement and example, would she revert to her old patterns of careful living and emotional distance? Would the adventurous, fully present person she had become prove to be just a temporary phase that couldn't survive without its creator? "I'm going to try my absolute best," Margaret said finally, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I think that's what your grandmother would want me to do, and I owe it to her to honor everything she's taught me." Zara nodded with approval that seemed far beyond her years. "Good. Because she's been telling everyone about how proud she is of you, about how you became the person you were always supposed to be. It would be really sad if you forgot how to be that person just because she's not here to remind you anymore." Ruby died on a Thursday morning in September, with Margaret, Charles, and her entire family surrounding her bed in the hospice unit. Her last words were characteristically optimistic and perfectly her, "What an absolutely incredible ride it's been, y'all." The funeral was unlike anything Margaret had ever attended in her 72 years. Instead of somber hymns and formal eulogies, it was a celebration that felt more like a joyful party than a traditional memorial service. Ruby's friends and family told stories that had everyone laughing through their tears. Stories about adventures and mishaps and moments of pure joy that Ruby had collected over the course of her remarkable and fully lived life. Margaret found herself asked to speak, though she had no idea what she could possibly say that would capture the transformative impact Ruby had made on her existence. She stood at the podium, looking out at a room filled with people who had been touched by Ruby's irrepressible spirit, and found herself telling the story of their first meeting in that hospital waiting room. "Ruby Washington saved my life," Margaret said, her voice growing stronger and more confident as she spoke, "not from cancer, though she certainly made that journey more bearable and meaningful. She saved me from a different kind of death entirely, the slow death of living without really being alive. She taught me that it's never too late to become who you're supposed to be, never too late to start living with courage and curiosity and open-hearted engagement with the world around you." Margaret paused, looking around the room at faces that reflected her own sense of profound loss and overwhelming gratitude. Ruby used to say that the real tragedy isn't dying, because everyone dies eventually. The real tragedy is never really living authentically. Well, thanks to her incredible influence, I can honestly say that I'm finally living the way I was meant to live. And I promise you, Ruby, wherever your spirit has gone, that I'm going to keep living the way you taught me to live, with wonder and courage and joy, for whatever time I have left on this earth. The months that followed Ruby's death were the most challenging period of Margaret's entire journey of transformation. Without her friend's constant encouragement and infectious example, Margaret found herself struggling to maintain the sense of adventure and openness that had become her new normal way of being. There were days when the old Margaret reasserted herself strongly. When the pull of routine and safety felt absolutely overwhelming, Margaret would catch herself planning her schedule with the same obsessive detail she had used before her diagnosis, or avoiding social situations that might require her to be vulnerable or spontaneous with strangers. But each time she felt herself sliding back into old patterns of behavior, something would remind her powerfully of Ruby's lessons and influence. Charles would suggest a spontaneous weekend trip to somewhere they'd never been. And instead of finding rational reasons to postpone it, Margaret would find herself saying yes enthusiastically. A neighbor would invite her to try a new restaurant or attend a community event, and instead of declining out of habit, Margaret would accept and discover new favorite experiences, slowly but surely. Margaret began to understand what Ruby had meant about becoming the teacher, instead of remaining the student forever. She started reaching out to other cancer patients at the hospital, sharing her story and encouraging them to think seriously about what they really wanted to do with whatever time they had left. Whether that was months or decades, she and Charles began taking regular adventures together. Nothing as dramatic as jumping out of airplanes or climbing mountains, but meaningful experiences that helped them rediscover each other after 45 years of marriage that had become somewhat routine. They took cooking classes, learned ballroom dancing, traveled to places they had always talked about visiting, but never quite managed to prioritize over work and social obligations. Most importantly, Margaret learned to find the extraordinary hidden within the ordinary. She began paying attention to sunsets, having real conversations with checkout clerks at the grocery store, taking time to genuinely appreciate the taste of her morning coffee. She discovered that living fully didn't require constant high adrenaline adventure. It required constant presence and gratitude. 6 months after Ruby's death, Margaret received an unexpected phone call from Zara, Ruby's granddaughter. She was working on a graduate school project about personal heroes and wanted to interview Margaret about her transformative friendship with her grandmother. "What was the most important thing Grandma Ruby taught you?" she asked during their video call, her grandmother's warmth and directness clearly visible in her manner. Margaret considered the question carefully, thinking back over all the adventures they had shared, all the conversations they had had, all the ways Ruby had challenged her to become a completely different kind of person. "She taught me that life is an adventure waiting to happen every single day," Margaret said finally with conviction. "Not just the big, dramatic adventures that make great stories, but the everyday adventures of connecting authentically with people, trying new things, staying curious about the world around you. She taught me that the choice to live fully is something you make every single day, not just during special occasions." Zara nodded with the serious expression that reminded Margaret so powerfully of her grandmother. "Are you still making that choice every day?" "Every single day," Margaret replied, and realized as she said it that it was absolutely and completely true. A year after Ruby's death, Margaret received the shocking news that her own cancer had gone into complete remission. The doctors couldn't explain it medically, couldn't point to any specific treatment or intervention that had caused the dramatic improvement in her condition. Margaret had her own theory, though she kept it mostly to herself. She believed that learning to live fully and authentically, learning to be present and grateful and engage with the world around her, had given her body the strength and will to fight more effectively. Ruby had saved her life in more ways than anyone would ever fully understand. Standing in her backyard on a crisp autumn morning, watching Charles plant bulbs that would bloom in the spring, Margaret felt a presence that might have been memory or imagination or something more mysterious and profound. She could almost hear Ruby's voice, reminding her that every day was a precious gift. Every moment was an opportunity for wonder. Every interaction was a chance to connect with the fundamental joy of being genuinely alive. Margaret Whitmore had learned to live, finally and completely and authentically, and she intended to keep living, with gratitude and courage and open-hearted engagement with whatever adventures lay ahead, for as long as the world would have her. The bucket list was complete, but the real adventure, Margaret now understood with crystal clarity, was just beginning. Every sunrise brought new possibilities. Every conversation held potential for connection. Every breath was an opportunity to practice the art of being fully alive. Ruby's greatest gift hadn't been the adventures themselves, but the understanding that adventure was a way of approaching life, not just a series of extraordinary events, and that gift would live on in Margaret, and hopefully in everyone whose life she touched. for generations to come. The bucket list had taught them both that it's never too late to become who you're meant to be. Never too late to start living with authentic joy and courage. That lesson would be Ruby Washington's eternal legacy, carried forward by everyone brave enough to choose life over mere existence, adventure over safety, authentic connection over comfortable isolation.